Okay. Okay. For this hour, we're going to cover the short story traditions of the Western Eurocentric short story. Let's go ahead and start the slideshow. How would you define what a short story is? Some critics say a short story is between 40 to 50,000 words. Some say 10 to 50 pages. There are a variety of definitions of a short story. But for the sake of clarity, I'm going to use Edgar Allan Poe's definition of a short story. And Poe defined a short story as a narrative whose parts, such as plot, characterization, atmosphere, theme, those are the four big ones of a narrative. Parts that are coordinated to create a single effect on the reader. That is, the story writer wants to make a reader feel a certain way at the end of each story, to feel a certain emotion such as joy, elation, anger, disgust, grief, amusement. The short story writer coordinates all the elements of her or his story to create this single effect on the reader. And the story writer's skill usually depends upon, you can judge a story's skill by how the readers react to the story. The first division of short story craft we're going to focus on is plot. The complications. Complications are simply events of the story, and drama, the clash or conflict in those events. But what types of dramatic conflict are there? Some people have stock terms for describing plot conflicts, such as man versus machine, man versus woman, man versus society, and a lot of other various ways. But Poe had three categories. The first one is the person versus person conflict. Poe called it a man versus man conflict because he was born in the 18th century. It's a very chauvinistic period anyway. I'm sorry, Poe was born in the 19th century. But anyway, let's get back to the person versus person conflict. The main character, protagonist, and the antagonist, who is in conflict with the main character, are engaged in a physical conflict. This is the conflict of action movies. This is the conflict of adventure stories. This is the conflict you see in comic books. It's usually a bad guy versus a good guy. Batman versus the Joker. Hercules versus Xena, warrior princess. The guys in the blue hats versus the guys in the green hats. This is a one party versus another story. And the drama intensifies with each successive event in the story. The writer wants to build up drama with each event, showing protagonist versus antagonist in more intense conflicts until finally at the end, when the drama is at its highest, one side wins. This is the person versus self conflict. This is a psychological conflict. Unlike the first conflict, this is the oldest type of conflict. Beowulf versus the dragon. The Greeks versus the Trojans. The knight versus the dragon. Now back to the person versus self conflict. Like I said, this is a psychological conflict. Look at the figure. The large guy eating all the money, and the smaller guy in the lower right-hand corner with a couple of pennies before him. Obviously, if this big guy is the main character, he is in a psychological conflict. His good side is in conflict with one of his or her destructive tendencies, and here, this character's good side is in conflict with his greed. Obviously, this is a selfish and greedy character. It's not a good character trait to have. The next, or third category that Poe looked at conflict in fiction by, is the person versus nature conflict. And this is a composite type of conflict. The protagonist, or main character, is in a dual conflict. And here we look at the businessman in his slacks, his shirt, walking across the desert with no boots, no gear, no supplies, and no water. The conflict on one side is physical, between the protagonist and the threat that the setting makes. And here, the setting is threatening to dehydrate the traveler or the businessman and kill him from dehydration or lack of water, lack of food. If this character were in a snowstorm, he would be in danger of freezing to death. If he were on the wrong side of town at night, he'd be in danger of being mugged, robbed, beaten, and possibly killed. Here the setting is posing a threat to the character, like the setting is a character itself. There's a second side of this conflict. It's a psychological side. And it's an internal conflict. The protagonist in danger would naturally feel fear. That is, he or she would fear dehydrating to death. And one thing he or she must do when faced with danger continuously is keep his or her head level and not lose his or her cool, because if this character does, he will die much more quickly than if he just dehydrated to death. So here in a person versus nature conflict, the protagonist is facing two types of antagonists. The physical side, that is, with the setting threatening to kill him, and then there's a psychological conflict too. He has to keep his or her head under pressure. Now you see, this is a combination of the first and second conflicts. Now, how are the events of a story usually arranged? Now, most writers do write their stories according to some sort of pattern to build up drama, to keep the reader interested, to sell the stories that they write to editors, and so that editors can print their stories and sell them to readers. The events of a story are meant to create a dramatically ascending series of crises. Now, look here in the lower left-hand corner, the inciting moment at the beginning of the story. What the writer does in the first few pages, as you follow that arrow, is introduce the reader at the beginning to the protagonist, maybe the setting. And eventually, after the introduction is completed, he or she will introduce the antagonist. And here, the protagonist and antagonist meet for the first time, and they engage in some sort of conflict, which builds in drama, builds in dramatic intensity until, at the end of this first event, the protagonist or antagonist wins. And before the drama can die, the author starts a second event, and again the protagonist and antagonist meet and clash. And this time in an event that's even more dramatic than the first. And you see the drama is rising up an incline of dramatic intensity. And when the second event ends, before the drama dies down, the competent writer, will start a third event that's even more dramatic than the second and the first events. And again, protagonists and antagonists will clash until the end. And usually, at the end of the third event, there's usually only 3 events in most short stories, Eurocentric short stories. Usually, it ends here, but in this example, there's a 4th event, and protagonists and antagonists clash in an even more intense event until finally the drama reaches its highest point near the climax of the story. Either protagonists and antagonists will win once and for all, and the story really ends here, except maybe there might be a subsequent denouement or tying up of loose ends at the end, which should be short and brief before the interest completely dies down. This is a pattern of most short stories that authors follow. They have to build up dramatic intensity, or else the reader's not going to want to read the story. The reader will put the book down, close the book, or not buy the book at all. What are the major parts of a short story? I already said there are 4 major parts. There's several parts of a short story, but there are 4 parts. These are the parts that keep the reader interested in the story. You have to have one of these parts working to write a successful story, a story that can sell. Complication. What is a complication? A unique or striking event, one which we may not see in everyday life. That is, a writer has to use events which fascinate the reader, which will keep him or her interested in the story and wanting to read the story. Normal, everyday humdrum events usually don't work in terms of entertaining a reader with a story. The more unique and striking, usually the more dramatic and more interesting they are to most readers. The second major element of narrative, characterization. What is characterization? It's 2 things here. A series of dilemmas or choices which a protagonist is forced to make. When you see characterization in the story, at each event, the main character is going to have a choice. He's going to choose between one good thing, which he or she may not want, and one bad thing, which is tempting to him or her. He or she, that is the protagonist, is torn between these choices at each major event in the story. The protagonist has to make a choice. Also, the description of the protagonist, his or her physical descriptions, how he or she looks, speaks, acts, his or her place of residence, those descriptions also are part of the characterization of a protagonist or a character. The third major part of narrative craft is atmosphere. And here, when you see atmosphere, look at the example, the tsunami, the huge tsunami wave coming in, threatening to wash away the innocent people on the beach. Atmosphere is the effect of the setting upon an impressionable character. Here the setting is taking the role of an antagonist, fighting to subdue or take over the protagonist. When you see atmosphere, you're going to see the person versus nature conflict. Here, the environment is threatening in 2 ways. Threatening the protagonist in 2 ways. It's threatening to kill them by drowning them. And also, they run under the threat of panicking or running over people are running into the wrong place and ensuring and raising the risk of them dying even more. The fourth major element of narrative is theme, or what the message of the story is. Now, the theme is the message, meaning, or moral of the story, and different people can read a story and find different interpretations of the theme. They would all be very similar, but they would also be different. Point of view. Now, the point of view of a narrative story, of a narrative. Several critics have different ways of classifying point of view: first person, second person, third person, omniscient, limited omniscient. There's several systems of classifying point of view, but Poe used a simple 3-category classification of point of view. And basically, he asked himself the question to determine what the point of view is and what character in the story provides the point of view. And he would ask the question, from whose eyes am I seeing the events of the story unfold? From whose eyes are you seeing this story? Usually, if you can figure out who we're looking at the story from, you can figure out which character is the point of view, and you can figure out who or what type of point of view is being used. Omniscient. This is the viewpoint of the author herself or himself. How can you tell that an author is using an omniscient viewpoint to tell the story? One clue is the events of the story are seen through the vision of the writer herself. It's like you're seeing a dream in the writer's head through his or her eyes. The reader is allowed to see everything, even things that a normal person could not see. People talking in real time to both St. Louis and New York together in one scene. A normal person without any technological aid could not see that. Also, if you read a story with multiple viewpoints, more than 2, 3, or 4 different viewpoints from different characters, the story tends to take on an omniscient viewpoint. Major character. This is the viewpoint of a person who's right there in the middle of the action. This is a person who's participating in the events. You would see the story from her or his point of view. Such as a football player, you would probably see him sitting in the grass, or you would feel him, and you would feel what he feels sitting in the grass, warming up, stretching his limbs to get ready for the game. You would see what he sees when he looks up and looks in the stands and sees the spectators coming in to take their seats to get ready for the game. He would see the officials congregating together to explain how they're going to officiate the game. And then maybe you would see him warming up, hitting his teammates to get ready for the big game. Or maybe see him or be with him while he walks out to the middle of the field to watch the referees toss the coin, and maybe hear him call the coin toss, and then run back to the sideline, go out to the field, and get ready to receive the kickoff. But you're going to be right there with the person who's right in the middle of the events in the major character viewpoint. The minor character viewpoint is the viewpoint of an observer. This is a person who stands in the periphery of the story and watches the major characters enact with each other, or watches the major characters go at it. Let's say if I were writing a story about an automobile crash, and the kid and I were to observe it while I'm walking down the street. I would watch the cars wreck. I would watch the drivers get out and argue, look at each other's cars. I would maybe watch one of them call the police and then stand there for a while until the police come and write their report, and then an insurance adjuster would come by. Maybe I would watch some observers come to the edge of the sidewalk and look at the accident too. Or maybe one of the major characters would come from the middle of the road over to talk to me briefly, to ask my opinion, and then go back to the middle of the street and argue with the other driver and the policeman. But the minor character is the viewpoint of a spectator and a commentator on the events. He or she is not really directly in the action. Now, how should you examine a story? I want you to answer these questions. This is how I generally think in terms of a story. So when we discuss stories, and I'll give you tests, these are the things I'm going to be looking for. What meaning might the title suggest? Usually, authors you have suggested titles that allude to two or more meanings, or play a pun or a word game upon meanings. What is the setting? Who or what is the protagonist? We definitely want to know who the protagonist is in the story. We also want to know who or what the antagonist is. There could be more than one antagonist. Think of the person versus nature plot, for example. What types of conflict exist in the story? Again, please list and explain each conflict. There can be one of these types of conflicts, there can be two, there can be all three types of conflict in the story, but you have to be able to identify where they are and with whom these conflicts exist. How is each conflict resolved in the end? And then number 7 is a difficult question. After the exposition, where we're introduced to the setting and the protagonist, how many events occur in the story? How many complications? Please list the events. If you have trouble counting the events in the story, think of the story as a movie. How many scenes are required to render the action of the story? If you were to make this story into an accurate movie that accurately portrays the story, how many scenes would you need? Usually the number of scenes would conform to the number of events in the story. Number 8, when does the drama of the story climax? When does the drama reach its absolute peak? The writer will be writing to build up to that moment of truth. Number 9, what points of view are used in the story? Again, think of Poe's 3-category classification. Ask yourself these questions. From whose eyes are you seeing the action of the story unfold? Also, you might ask from whose voice is telling you the events of the story. Those 2 questions are pretty helpful. Then finally, number 10, what themes or messages emerge in this story? Now that we got a good idea or basis of what I believe narrative is, we can start reading the stories and discussing the stories. So next, I probably want you to move on to read some sample stories written by students, former students of mine. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, just please log on to the discussion board and ask me or send me an